the long, arduous train journey across the American interior, often stretching for days or even weeks from the Atlantic ports or Gulf Coast receiving stations, was itself the first unsettling introduction to the sheer scale of the nation the Axis soldiers had been fighting. They had left behind the shattered earth of North Africa or the muddy, frozen fields of Europe, anticipating the harsh, temporary confinement characteristic of rear echelon prison cages. Instead, the final destination, typically marked by long, meticulously graded spur lines branching off the main rails, brought them face to face with an infrastructure of astounding, unexpected permanence. They disembarked, dust coating their field gray or tan uniforms, often blinking against the fierce sun of the American West or the humid air of the South, to witness not hastily constructed barbed wire pens, but vast, organized compounds stretching over hundreds of acres. These were not emergency facilities. They were engineered settlements. The visual shock was immediate. Rows upon rows of freshly milled pine barracks, their surfaces still smelling faintly of sap and sawdust, stood arranged with the geometric precision of a military parade ground. The structures were standardized, solid, and undeniably new, a profound contrast to the salvaged materials and provisional housing many had seen utilized in their own armed forces. They had expected brutal efficiency. They found an unsettling, well-financed modernity. This fundamental stability, the visible proof of America's inexhaustible material wealth, paved the way for the 5 critical comforts that redefined captivity and fundamentally shocked the Axis prisoners' worldview. These were not mere acts of charity, but logistical triumphs so comprehensive they bordered on propaganda, demonstrating a standard of living that even many American civilians were finding challenging to maintain under wartime rationing. The first, and arguably the most visceral shock, occurred in the mess hall. For soldiers who had known the creeping hunger of the Russian front, the monotonous diet of the Afrika Korps, or the scarcity economics imposed by the Reich Ministry of Food, the sight of the U.S. military standard ration was baffling. The initial encounters with the American mess system were often documented with wide-eyed disbelief. They were ushered into large, open dining halls, the air thick with the combined, satisfying scent of roasting meat, strong coffee, and freshly baked yeast. The expectation was a thin gruel, maybe a scrap of protein, perhaps dark, dense bread made of substitutes and filler. The reality was a daily caloric intake, mandated by adherence to the Geneva Conventions and often exceeding 3,000 calories, designed to sustain healthy manual laborers. The food was delivered hot, ladled onto galvanized steel trays that clattered softly as they were distributed. The prisoners observed steam rising not from meager soup, but from substantial portions of stewed beef or pork, thick gravy, and mounds of buttery potatoes. The simple luxury of white bread, baked daily in the camp bakeries, was a staggering privilege. White flour, pure and soft, was a rapidly diminishing commodity across the Axis nations, reserved increasingly for the wounded or the elite. Here it was piled high in generous slices, often slathered with real butter or oleo. Breakfast was a particular marvel. Prisoners accustomed to ersatz coffee and dry, hard biscuits suddenly found themselves facing eggs cooked various ways, hot cereal, and, most shocking of all, fresh milk. Milk, a perishable commodity requiring immense logistical coordination, was delivered reliably, day after day, not condensed or powdered, but cool and whole. For soldiers who had not tasted fresh milk or cream in years, the sensory experience was overwhelming. Furthermore, the consistency of access to American coffee, strong, dark, and often sweetened with sugar, was a constant source of wonder. Coffee was not merely a beverage, it was a psychological anchor, a taste of comfort that defined the American morning. Even minor items like ketchup, copious amounts of sugar, or canned fruit cocktail spoke volumes. The prisoners were eating better, consistently, than millions of American factory workers who strictly adhered to ration books, and certainly better than most of the civilian population of their own home countries. The mess hall was less a place of feeding and more a daily, tangible demonstration that the United States had so many resources it could afford to feed its enemies like honored guests, simply because it possessed the infrastructure to do so effortlessly. The logistical might required to maintain this level of variety and freshness in remote locations across the American continent was in itself a profoundly sobering realization for the captured officers. The window frame is the boundary, separating the fading warmth of the mess from the solid, raw truth of the external wood. Axis troops, whether operating in the unforgiving desert sands or the frozen Russian steppes, were accustomed to the temporary nature of wartime housing: tents, dugouts, repurposed barns, or bombed-out structures. Their expectations for a POW camp revolved around damp canvas, insufficient insulation, and the constant struggle against the elements. The U.S. camps, however, utilized standardized plans developed by the Quartermaster Corps. These were not tents, they were meticulously constructed barracks made of newly milled lumber. The buildings featured insulated walls, often lined with fiberboard or plywood, creating a clean, tight seal against the exterior weather. They were built on raised wooden pilings, protecting the inhabitants from ground moisture and dampness. The most critical feature, particularly in camps stretching from the frigid Great Lakes region down to the high plains of Texas, was the reliable heating system. Whether powered by coal furnaces or oil burners, the barracks maintained an interior temperature that allowed prisoners to exist in relative comfort, stripping off their layers of travel-stained wool and feeling warmth soak into their perpetually cold bones. Many noted that this level of dependable central heating was something even many lower-ranking officers in the Wehrmacht rarely experienced at home, let alone in the field. The air inside these barracks smelled of fresh wood, heating oil, and dry, circulating air, a smell of safety. Equally shocking was the access to robust, reliable indoor plumbing and sanitation. Most German and Italian units relied on rudimentary, often freezing, outdoor latrines and communal wash troughs. In the American camps, the sanitary facilities were often equivalent to low-end civilian housing of the era. They featured rows of reliable flush toilets, sinks with running hot and cold water, and most importantly, shower facilities that offered pressurized warm water on a daily basis. The ability to maintain personal hygiene, to wash away the grit of the battlefield, the dust of the railroad journey, and the persistent smell of trench life was an immense psychological uplift. It restored a sense of personal dignity that military captivity typically stripped away. The whiteness of the porcelain, the strength of the water pressure, and the sheer volume of clean water available were constant reminders of the vast chasm between American resources and the crippling shortages plaguing their homelands. The infrastructure was so sound, so deeply integrated into the compounds, that prisoners never worried about water supply or sewage removal. These were concerns that the American logistics machine simply handled, silently and effectively. The third comfort, perhaps the most paradoxical given the environment of confinement, was the comprehensive and robust leisure infrastructure provided. A prisoner of war expected boredom, deprivation of stimulus, and the slow, grinding erosion of the mind. The American administration, however, understood that idle hands and minds were catalysts for trouble. Consequently, they invested heavily in providing structured mental and recreational activities, transforming simple detention centers into strange, quasi-educational civilian communities. The heart of this intellectual resistance to confinement was the camp library. These were not dusty shelves of discarded paperbacks. They were well-stocked facilities, often housed in separate, quieter buildings, featuring thousands of volumes. Crucially, the military went to immense effort to procure and translate books. Shelves were lined with crisp new copies of Goethe, Schiller, modern philosophy, technical manuals, and popular contemporary fiction, all printed in German or Italian. For prisoners who valued education and high culture, a trait common among the captured Afrika Korps units, the access to uncensored, high-quality literature was an astonishing gift. The quiet rustle of turning pages, the smell of fresh ink on paper, and the ability to lose oneself in a novel by Thomas Mann while razor wire defined the perimeter created a surreal bubble of cultured normalcy. This leisure was not intended as distraction, but as professional development. Officers, in particular, were often given space and materials to continue their education, ensuring they remained mentally stimulated. Adjacent to the libraries were the recreational halls. These buildings buzzed with activity, serving as centers for drama, craft, and especially music. The logistics of the U.S. system extended even to providing musical instruments. Makeshift orchestras formed and flourished in many camps. Imagine the scene. In a temporary wooden hall, under the glare of incandescent bulbs, men who had recently been shooting at Americans were now tuning fiddles and polishing brass. The air would vibrate with the unexpected sounds of high culture, a slightly rusty trombone delivering a Bach fugue, or a makeshift string section rehearsing a German folk tune. The visual contrast was striking. Uniformed men, confined behind wire, intently focused on sheet music, their breath frosting the air near the poorly insulated windows on a cold evening, producing music that was refined and sophisticated. They staged full theatrical productions, complete with homemade costumes and sets cobbled together from scrap materials, performing for audiences of their fellow captives. This allowance for creativity and intellectual pursuits was utterly foreign to the concept of total war detention, and was only made possible by the enormous logistical bureaucracy dedicated not just to guarding them, but to managing their mental well-being. The fourth comfort provided the most immediate, tangible, and capitalistic shock: the subsidized camp economy and the canteen. Access prisoners had anticipated a total loss of economic agency. They were captives, stripped of rank and possessions, expecting to be totally reliant on the meager provisions provided by the captor. Instead, the U.S. system, adhering rigorously to the 1929 Geneva Convention regarding pay for labor, initiated a massive internal economy using camp scrip. Prisoners who opted to work, and the vast majority did, eager to escape the boredom of the compounds, were paid wages. This labor was crucial to the American war effort, as Axis prisoners filled massive gaps in agricultural harvesting, forestry, maintenance of the camps themselves, and other essential but low-priority tasks. They received 80 cents per day in scrip, though this amount was adjusted for skill and often exceeded depending on the task. This camp scrip was the foundation of a bizarre, isolated capitalist system. It was useless outside the wire, printed in varying denominations, often colored blue or pink, stamped with the camp name, and resembling large, heavy poker chips or military payment certificates. Inside the wire, however, this script was currency for the most critical place of interaction, the canteen. The canteen was the true heart of the subsidized existence, a place of small, attainable luxury. The prisoners could purchase items that were either heavily rationed or entirely unavailable in their home countries. The sensory details of the canteen were powerfully nostalgic and seductive. The smell of cheap American tobacco, Camels or Lucky Strikes, mingled with the overpowering sweetness of mass-produced candy bars, Hershey bars, Mars bars, and other highly sugared treats. The visual appeal of rows of brightly packaged goods, completely foreign to the austere European market, was stunning. The most potent symbol of this economic freedom was the cold soda bottle. The clinking sound of glass bottles, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, or local generic sodas, being slid across the wooden counter, and the sharp hiss of the cap being popped off were sounds of victory over deprivation. For a few cents of hard-earned scrip, a prisoner could purchase a cold, sweet, carbonated drink, an item that for many, even high-ranking Axis officers, had become a relic of a pre-war world. This system utterly transformed the experience of captivity. It meant that a prisoner was not merely surviving, he was participating in a bizarre, low-stakes economy that allowed him to choose his vices, personalized his diet, and purchase gifts for himself or his comrades. They could buy shaving supplies, soap, writing paper, and even, in some cases, musical strings or art supplies. This subsidized economy created an environment that was deeply unsettling to those accustomed to the deprivation of war. They were prisoners, yet they possessed purchasing power, transforming expected hardship into a sort of bizarre, paid vacation from the battlefield. Finally, the fifth and most ethically profound comfort offered was the system of truly objective and superior medical care. In the brutal environment of the front lines, medical priority was determined by necessity and rank, and battlefield treatment was often primitive. For a soldier accustomed to the concept that captured enemies received minimal care, enough to survive interrogation, perhaps, but certainly not high-level treatment, the American medical infrastructure was a profound ethical and practical shock. The camp infirmaries were not makeshift tents. They were purpose-built, sterile, and professional medical facilities, often staffed by American doctors and nurses, mostly male due to military restrictions on female nursing in POW environments, as well as captured enemy medical personnel. The smell was powerfully antiseptic, the floors often gleaming white tile or linoleum, the light bright and direct. The level of care provided was strictly regulated to be identical to that afforded to American servicemen. This meant that a German soldier with a lingering shrapnel wound or a chronic tropical disease contracted in North Africa received the same quality of surgical intervention, medication, and convalescent care as the man who had captured him. Dental care, a luxury virtually unheard of in the field and neglected by millions of civilians during the war, was provided routinely. The prisoners, suffering from years of poor diet and neglect, were often stunned to receive thorough examinations, fillings, and even complex extractions performed by professional dentists utilizing modern equipment. This level of preventative and restorative care demonstrated a commitment to the integrity of the prisoner far beyond basic humane treatment. It treated them as patients, not simply as enemy bodies. Furthermore, complex battlefield injuries, amputations, internal wounds, and severe chronic conditions like tuberculosis or malaria were addressed with the full scope of American medical technology and pharmacology. Doctors adhered to the Hippocratic Oath with unwavering dedication, prioritizing the health of the patient, regardless of the uniform worn. For prisoners indoctrinated with the racial hierarchies and selective ethics of the Third Reich, this impartial, high-level medical attention was profoundly disorienting. It erased the concept of discriminatory neglect. In the sterile brightness of the camp infirmary, ideology yielded entirely to the objective science of healing. The cumulative effect of these 5 comforts, the unprecedented quality and quantity of food, the structural security of well-heated and plumbed housing, the luxury of comprehensive educational and leisure pursuits, the economic freedom of the subsidized canteen, and the impartiality of world-class medical care served a purpose far exceeding simple adherence to the Geneva Conventions. These U.S. POW camps became, in essence, an unintentional, sustained demonstration of American logistical and industrial superiority. They showcased a nation so wealthy, so organizationally capable, that it could run a parallel, luxurious society for its enemies, while simultaneously fighting a global two-front war. Captured soldiers, particularly those who were ardent National Socialists, often struggled to reconcile the image of a soft, collapsing, Jewish-influenced American society, as portrayed by Goebbels' propaganda machine, with the tangible, overwhelming reality of their confinement. The clean sheets, the fresh meat, the stacks of translated books, and the reliable running water spoke a powerful, undeniable truth. The nation they were fighting was not resource-strapped or disorganized. It possessed an abundance that defied their every wartime expectation, capable of manufacturing comfort on an industrial scale. The psychological consequence of this shock was often reported in military intelligence debriefings. Rather than breeding resentment, the high standard of living often fostered a bewildered, grudging respect. When these prisoners were eventually repatriated, they carried with them not only the stories of capture, but the sensory memory of the vast, inexhaustible resources of the United States. The smell of pine lumber, the taste of fresh coffee and white sugar, the sound of their own music echoing in the recreational halls, all safely contained behind the cold, glinting razor wire boundaries of an unsettling, luxurious detention. The American POW camps were, in the end, an aggressive demonstration of logistics, converting captivity itself into a profound, often traumatic, lesson in American power.